But this is the reality for many people. I mean, they face this threat because this is really a threat. 2 mandatory office days per week, or else bad things will happen. I think it was even Elon Musk who said something like that about the factory, the gigafactory in Germany. Plenty of banks did that. Um, and I'm a little bit torn because this statement, it really looks wrong. Shall we start now? No, I mean, right, right. I will be talking about that, or perhaps I will not. But this is the question. So it turns out that what managers wanted to do, or the boards what they wanted to find a good way of working remotely. And if you are responsible for making a policy for the company, the easiest question then you can ask yourself, and which seems to make everyone happy, is how many days should everyone spend in the office per week? Now, is that the official start? Okay, let's make that the official start. Now, the problem with that is that if you say that you want everyone else to be in the company 1 day per week, then you will quickly discover that people are not talking to each other because you show up in the office and you might be one of the 8 people in the entire building because it's Monday early in the morning. Hi, Holger. Do you want to say something before I start?
Always glad to listen one of your presentation. I'm very happy about it. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Holger. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me here. Um, so, right. And on the other hand, it was very tempting to get everyone back to the office, but there was, and I think there still is, a substantial resistance to doing that. I had a chance to talk to people who will say they will instantly quit if they are forced back to the office. Um, and that they consider remote work to be a basic requirement of even considering a job. They were in the IT space, so they could be quite picky. But anyway, this said something. And I have background in mapping. I've been a remote worker myself for a really long time. So I thought, well, this question doesn't look right. And why doesn't it look right? It was mostly because of the Simpsons paradox, which I've picked up from Simon, which says that if you have two different populations and you do a survey across them and you average the results, then you get completely rubbish result. And this question, 2 mandatory office days per week or else, is actually an answer to such a rubbish question. So what I wanted to talk today about is how my research looked like and what I really should have done in the past. So my research worked like this. There was a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was based on the Simpson paradox that people want to go to the office as long as they are getting something from it, and that there are different groups of people which are getting different values from the office work. So based on the Simpson paradox, I've designed a survey with, I think, 15 different questions. I issued it. I've got a number of stories, and I've tried to unpack what was in those stories. And unfortunately, it turned out that this was the approach that led almost to nowhere, because everyone loved working remotely, almost everyone. Even people who had terrible living conditions, who were like grad students living with their parents, and they really didn't have any designated room to work. Even people who had difficult family situation, they all wanted to work remotely, mostly because they didn't have to commute. But what we picked up in this research was also that there was a group of people who never really wanted to give up the office work, and the thing why is the most interesting one, because it introduced the discipline in their lives. So there was private life and there was work life. And it turns out that this particular aspect conditioned me to do further research, which I will now present as a map, and I should actually start with mapping. But before we get there, coevolution of practice, this is the pattern that I bet you are all familiar with. So you've probably seen this example explained a lot in the past. There is a practice, a best practice ideal, which is supposed to work with a particular type of capability. There is the need, and what happens? Characteristics change, so we are entering the cloud space, and therefore the entire best set of best practices gets invalidated. A new set of practices gets born, and in the beginning, those new practices, much less mature, they look like they are inferior compared to the idea to the previous space. And it needs time to mature, and perhaps in the future, that's the assumption, it will help generate better and faster results. Now, there is a big question in my head going on, and I don't have the answer, because in this slide, Simon showed the transition from product to commodity, but talked about the median time to recovery, because it is much faster to provision a server in the cloud than to provision server physically in your private data center. And when I think about it and consider this to be a weak hypothesis, not a part of the official mapping teachings, there is actually a pattern which is triggered by a transition of a thing from product to commodity, and there is an associated transition which we call boiling frogs. So slowly but surely, new practices emerge. But you can imagine that there is a transition from a commodity to commodity, completely unpredictable, happen mostly through regulatory means. And this is sort of the earthquake, because in almost no time you have to change how do you operate. And there are different types which seem to have different characteristics. Again, this is just, let's say, a complementary knowledge. It may be useful a little bit later, but doesn't have to. So, getting back to the remote work. Inspired by these characteristics of change, I started thinking, so if we think about the remote work, what characteristics have really changed? And this is a very short list. So, first of all, the commute time got reduced, and now I have IT background. So, for me, commuting from my bed to my desk is still commute, but with near zero time. The physical proximity of the office got replaced with on-off proximity, where you can turn off your camera, microphone, or computer, and suddenly you are not with everyone else. Mandatory time spent together disappeared, so you are not spending your time together with other employees unless you really want to. And finally, you don't have the access to the function-oriented locations. So offices were designed with certain goals in mind. You were supposed to find or to bump into other people. There was the concept of water cooler conversations. There were conference rooms, perhaps collaboration rooms, and plenty of that stuff. If you happen to work remotely, that stuff is gone. And even worse than that, you are supposed to work from a place which had different design goal. So it was supposed to help you to make your life nicer, better, or even possible, but definitely wasn't designed for work. And if we look at the first one, at those commute times, here we are getting a very interesting stories, which I was able to categorize from the initial survey. So there are people who really need commute because of the work-life separation. What happens during that travel? That travel constitutes a ritual which helps people transition from being themselves into being office workers. And this is important because as an office worker, you are expected to be calm, professional. You are expected to work, but not too hard. That's my opinion. You are expected to work, but not too hard. And you are expected to look and behave as the office worker. If you don't have this separation, if you don't have to commute to the office, that means that you have to be yourself with all your ups and downs all the time. There is no separate identity. You can't leave problems at home or at work. You will be constantly connected to them. And for some reason, at this point, you clearly realize that this separation is critical for, I would say, mental health. But if you are going to live with no separation, you have to compensate this lack of role switching. At the same time, there's one more thing I want to mention here. The commute become extremely short, even for the long distances, meaning you can connect to your job from any place in the world. And this introduces non-linearity because if you have companies with geographical constraints, so you can commute to a job for an hour or 2 hours, let's say that's the reasonably painful, the reasonable point of pain. What happens is that if you introduce remote work, suddenly all the companies have access to all the talent pool. There is increased competition between different companies for the same talent pool. You may see things such as great resignation, talent wars, and plenty of other stuff, which I bet you see in the media. So this is how I explain that stuff. But this thing is only temporary because if you have companies without geographical constraints, there will be one, perhaps two winners per each market niche, and everyone else will scramble to get whatever has been left by those big companies. The big companies that win this transformation to non-remote work are very likely to be even more successful in the future because they will be able to offer better pay, and because of the better pay they will get better people, they will get even bigger market share. So it's like a flywheel that self perpetuates. Now I've tried to put it on the everything on the map in terms of the work. And if you think about commute and how do you want to replace your commute skills with remote equivalent, with the practices which help you separate work from life, you actually have to think about the rest management. So how much time do you spend resting? And this has to be deliberate because commuting, it was a norm that everyone accepted. So when you traveled back to home, you could rest afterwards. If you are working remotely, you have to take conscious effort to plan your rest, which is extremely counterintuitive. Therefore, you need to be a fluent user of calendars and scheduling. You need to manage your environment. In the work, you have different work locations depending on the task. If you are a knowledge worker working remotely, you are probably sitting the entire day in front of the same desk. regardless of whether you are doing creative work, whether you are responding to boring emails, or whether you are doing whatever your job requires you to do. There is the question about the work equipment, because the work equipment become the face of the corporation that hires you. And this is a fun fact because I have noticed, and this was on the verge of statistical, let's say, confidence, that people who buy their own work equipment, in other words, the company says that they are not worth better equipment. People who are buying their own equipment also tend to do side projects on the company time and learn whatever they find important on company time. So this says something about the relationship between the company and the remote worker, where the remote worker got a more independent mindset, to the point where you can even consider remote workers being solopreneurs. So like entrepreneurs, but on a really small scale. There is emotional management because rest management and environment management, I mean, they can happen alone, but you will not be able to work if you can't manage your emotions, and you need to manage your emotions if you want to manage your habits. And those things, they are all a replacement of a single commute function. Pretty expensive replacement because it isn't like we are being taught by anyone except our parents how to do that stuff efficiently in the remote environment. So this is why I would say that HR plays critical roles in making sure that every remote worker knows how to do that stuff. Now I might be right. Some people will hate it, and some people will say that the HR department shouldn't go that far because there is a very good point, Manish. There is a very delicate balance between HR helping people achieve those skills and individual mastery, and HR being nosy and actually checking how people are doing that stuff and whether they are doing that stuff right. So there is the question of enablement versus control, and I haven't found many companies which are doing it or seem to be doing it right. Now that that stuff here, this commute and individual equivalence, let us segue into the next thing that has changed, and this is the scheduling and prioritization, the core, almost the core orchestration activity which happens in every organization all the time. In the office, because people are in one space, in one time, and they are focused on the work, they had the office worker hat. They tend to do scheduling and prioritization almost instantly on the fly. Of course, there are calls during which you are supposed to do schedules and stuff like that. There are some tools which help you with that. But I would say that the majority of real-time scheduling and task orchestration happens on the fly. It doesn't work in the remote environment. You no longer can say that you will be at the same time in the same place as anyone else, because people mix their private and professional lives. They go to the dentist, they look after their kids. No way that this is going to happen. No way that remote workers are going to update priorities in real time. And finally, and this was the worst case, in the office, meeting rooms seem to act as a constraint. So you can, at any given point in time, you can have only so many meetings. In the remote work, the only constraint is your calendar, which means that you can spend as much time in calls as you want, or perhaps even as your calendar will allow, much more than you would be comfortable to. The question I can see, do you think that using personal device and working on other stuff in personal time is a way of saying that they have stopped selling their time and started making money for their skills? Yes, this is exactly the thing. If you have people who have invested in their own capabilities, for those people, changing a job is as simple as signing a contract, and they will, the next day, they will wake up and go to the same office, which they have always used, which is their desk, log into the same system they have always used, but perhaps use a different Slack channel. So remote workers got catapulted into that space, and sooner or later, I think they will realize what kind of power they've got. Now, about the information exchange overhead. This is a big pain personally for me, because in the office, when you want to learn something or you want to find a person that knows something, it's usually a matter of hours before you do that. In the remote environment, it can take days or weeks, because the process of scheduling calls, and you need to rely on scheduling, on painful long scheduling, because people mix their private and professional lives, and scheduling is just more difficult, so you have to make it formal. In the remote environment, it takes a really long time to find where the knowledge is, and this creates prioritization and scheduling in the traditional office. They got replaced by prioritization happening in the virtual environment, scheduling, and this concept of getting together. Because what we have seen in the surveys is that some people and some organizations tend to get together rather physically every couple of weeks, so somewhere from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, to do the planning and prioritization. And this is the prioritization which looks forward a lot. So it says, if you will experience a conflict between different priorities or between different goals, this is what you should do. The goal of this thing is to reduce the time necessary for calls, because your you don't want to have your projects delayed because you can't get the right knowledge from your managers. So they have to be pretty proactive and think about what ifs much time ahead. Excuse me. Santeri, this is an excellent point. So, if information takes a long point, yes, there are practices which started emerging, not everywhere, but we see, let's say, some companies embrace it, other companies try to get it right. So, first of all, there is this practice of unblocking others. So you want to book a part of your time to make sure that nobody else is stuck and waiting on you. Again, it requires deliberate effort. And there is this very ugly term of knowledge management and documenting stuff and making it ready for reuse. So instead of looking for a person with knowledge, you can basically do a basic search. And this is, again, funny, because for a person like me with the IT background and rather certain distaste for writing or recording stuff, this is the basic skill that you need in the remote environment. You need to be able to write about the knowledge that you have acquired. You need to have a good understanding of what needs to be written for the people that might need that knowledge in the future, perhaps even if you are writing for yourself. Tools such as Loom enable new levels of communication. Perfect. There are also tools which record all the calls do transcripts, and then extract keywords and prepare summaries. So you can put alerts for particular phrases and then watch a particular part, a few minutes of a call, which discussed something with a full context. So this is where, again, we are having a combination of corporate function, because knowledge management will not happen without the tooling support. On the other hand, it will not happen without those basic skills, reading, writing, searching, and recording, which need to be mastered by individuals. Again, job for HR or for managers to make it happen. And the worst part, it all depends on culture. So if your manager thinks that spending time, excuse me, spending time on writing the knowledge is a waste of time, that your company as a whole cannot function in the remote environment. I mean, it will function, but it will not get the benefits of remote work. Non-tech solution is to advertise office hours. This is good if you assume that people will work at the same time. This is certainly a workaround. Asynchronous communications can help, but asynchronous communication requires you to think rather in throughput, how many things you accomplish in a given block of time, rather than in how much time do you need to accomplish a single thing. So you need to have a pipeline of things done, and this is complicated in itself. But in general, all that stuff which is on the left hand side, it still hasn't been codified. We don't know best practices. We know something is emerging. So if you want to get this stuff done, you have to experiment. Another interesting story is the postgraduate guidance. People who freshly finished their education, they had a significant need to go to the office. Why? Because they hoped they will learn there something about the company. The biggest problem, because I've heard about companies creating postgraduate programs, the biggest problem was that if postgraduates got into the office, there was nobody in the office um, to help them uh, acquire the necessary knowledge. Barbara, can you talk about the surveillance and monitoring that is part of much remote work? Right. There are two things here, and I will try to answer that question. Um, I will try to answer that question perhaps in the best possible way, and I will stick my head here out a little bit, because this is an increasingly difficult, difficult problem to solve, and I don't know what's the answer here. One of the first things or first points when I have experienced or faced that problem was this concept of having an adequate work equipment for the work. So I'm a knowledge worker, and I let's say know a lot of other knowledge workers, and what they have reported was that the company had the responsibility to look after the health of remote workers. So the company wanted to know what are the working conditions in which those people spend time, and ask them for photos. This is extremely, extremely risky move, because it requires employees making photos of their homes and sending them to HR. You can imagine all the controversies associated with that. In the end, I think it created some, let's say, some significant, uh, it dragged some significant attention. It was a little bit relaxed, and we've got self and we've got self let's say self-assessments, or not just self-assessments, basically employees waived the duties of the company. Again, this is very tricky. I'm not sure if it was tested in the court, and I can imagine that this sort of problems will get even more difficult if you have remote workers which have to deal with really, let's say, confidential information such as health records, credit card data, social stuff. I don't know what else. Because in a corporation, in an office, the office is usually expected to be safe and secure from third party. In a private home or worse, in a public cafe, that's not really the case. So I would say that if you have to handle sensitive information, the company should look, rather than invading privacy, the company should look for a compromises, which means finding people office close to their homes, like a shared workspace, which is actually an interesting case because it's neither remote nor office-based work. You are working in a shared space in an office designated for the work, which can be tested for security to some extent, but it isn't office. You don't get the commute penalty. Yeah, trust issues. Mark, that's not hybrid. I hate the word hybrid. I will get there. Management. That one is the most painful one because in the office you get direct management. So manager sees, manager evaluates, manager tells you what to do most of the time. In the remote environment, the communication is expensive, so you know it will not work this way. In the remote environment, the management has to build metrics and KPIs and let employees find the way to make those metrics and KPIs better. And this is on a completely different level of complexity compared to the traditional direct management of people in the office. Again, this isn't tied to the remote work only because we have seen organizations which try that before remote work, but remote work tells you that this is the stuff that is mandatory because otherwise you are not able to see what people are doing or how they are behaving. And the worst part is when I look at the map, right? So we've talked about that stuff. This is the traditional management based on commuting and people being in the same place and in the same time. It works naturally without anyone trying, without anyone paying attention. Of course, it works better or worse depending on what kind of a manager do you face, right? But this is like a very human and natural way of thinking. The KPI stuff, the knowledge worker, this is, I would say, something new to people in general. Of course, I know that in the audience or people that will watch it, some of you were exposed to that, or some of you are even doing consulting how to do that stuff properly. But doing that stuff and designing this live organization is again critical for the survival of the, okay, perhaps for the performance of the company in the next couple of years. But this requires so much effort that plenty of people just prefers to stick with it. And this is where we are getting to this perhaps naive explanation that from a management perspective, from the board perspective, it's often easier to say, get back to the office a couple of times per week so things will work as we have expected them to work in the past. And this doesn't have to be wrong. One more thing about this stuff. Plenty of people and financial directors got excited about savings on real estate and offices. If you look at this map, you can see already how much investment is needed to make remote work work. Actually, even build more trust with your employees. If you want to have employees which do care, which are properly motivated, and which don't require as much supervision as perhaps less motivated employees, so that you can allow remote work, there is the question of compensation, motivation, and that stuff, which will all be costly. So I would say it's one of the biggest mistakes to assume that remote work will save you significant lumps of money. It may, but not all the savings should be redirected to the profit category. There are some expenses to be made in this space, right? And finally, one interesting thing: status. In the office, it's natural because people, usually managers, they are giving verbal and non-verbal cues about what is the role of a particular person in the organization. You see it in posture, you see it in their manners, and you see in things they write and speak. In the remote environment, this stuff seems to be gone. So status is perhaps disrupted, or the natural hierarchy between people is disrupted. And some managers will try to rebuild it. And there are two ways to do that. One is through being extremely witty, because I have recently learned that this is the primary sign. I mean, one of the two most important signs of human status, of how witty you can be. And the second one is remote managers can make people do things outside of their normal preferences. So if you get, okay, so I would say that if you get a message from your boss which asks you to join a meeting outside of your normal preferences, it doesn't say a lot about the urgency of the meeting most of the time. It says a lot about your relationship with your boss and what your boss wants really tell you through that message. Right, so that was the last thing. Consequences. Lack of compatibility. First of all, what we have seen that management solutions from office-based work don't seem to work in the remote environment because characteristics have changed. Hybrid is very difficult to get in that space. Remote work solutions will not be as effective as face-to-face work solutions in the face-to-face environment because they are not natural. It takes effort to build all the skills and sustain all the habits that you need in the remote environment. And some people say they've got hybrid working, but they could get it in two ways. One was the aforementioned shared working locations or offices near people, places of living. So that can be classified as hybrid. But the other version of the hybrid is that you get all people or some people commute to the office, and then everyone in the office puts their headphones on and joins the remote conference. So they get the worst of the office work, they have to commute, and of the remote work, they don't have face to face interactions. I would really question whether that is possible, and I would suggest avoiding that kind of solutions if only possible and negotiable. Right, I've covered that. I think. What we know for sure: transition is temporary. Early adopters of remote work will certainly gain advantage because this is where they can get the best talent from the market. And the most difficult thing for people to accept: autopilot doesn't work, nor does waiting. Plenty of stuff that we have discussed sits or relies on company culture. So If you are not actively trying to shift your culture or to welcome remote working methods in your environment, there is no chance you will be able to pick them up in the future. Because your culture, you will be saying that you want to work in a particular way, and remote work will never be answer for that work. Lessons learned on a personal level: supporting structures are gone. This is about commute and the office space. Um, Corporate functions can make or break remote work in a company. And this is beyond, I think, I trust, this is beyond the control of individual people. You either get the board and the leadership all in remote work, and they approve, recognize the cost associated with it, and approve experimentation improving state of the remote work in the company, or you may not bother at all. And some individuals are a bit better prepared for remote work, especially if they are in the position of power so they can negotiate better working conditions, ironclad discipline to put those rests in your calendar and make sure that when you say you don't work no matter what. You need to build emotional resilience and excellent alignment of your goals, because if you don't have your personal goals aligned with the company goals, and remember, you are not switching identity or role when commuting, you will suffer from the grind and from all the difficulties that usually follow incoherent goal. And the worst part for me, the true cost of a burnout remain invisible, because if you and an individual have no support in terms of building the discipline, the power within the organization, aligning your goals and building emotional resilience, or what's worse, if your boss expects you to work 10 hours per day or even more, then the burnout, it takes time to develop, and the organization will not notice it for the, let's say, for some or perhaps longer period of time. Thank you so much for your attention. Questions, if we have any. All of the office-based arguments assume that offices are good. They are just paper factories. Yep.
Chris,
Yes.
wonderful, wonderful session. I really liked it. One question I have, right? We say the practices are still evolving, and maybe company like Tesla, I won't call Tesla, maybe some other company, they want people to come to office from tomorrow, right? So what would be the situation of the employees who have started getting used to working from home? Would they?
Ah. Oh, so this is an excellent question. I think I can at the same point cover Hawkins' question about data, how incentives are moving. Right. I'm not sure if this is data. This is more rather a story uh, which shows particular direction of movement, and I would love to get some data, but that might be a little bit too early for that. So we've talked about this situation where you have remote workers which are becoming solopreneurs, right? And this is very tricky. So you are working for an organization, but because you have invested in your equipment, you are investing in your skills based on your best beliefs, not based on what the company believes is right for the company. You are actually an independent kind of contractor. And if you are in that position, then I would say that there are two ways. One is you embrace that role and that direction. And if the company says go to the office, you either negotiate a bigger pay or you say, sorry, that's not what I want to do. I will look for for opportunities elsewhere because I'm well prepared for that. I did that. I learned those skills. I have the equipment. I will do fine. Or you just say, fine, thank you. That was a nice adventure. Times to go back to the office. And the answer isn't like there is a better answer or a better choice because it depends a lot on your circumstances. If you are 2 years from retirement, if I were 2 years from retirement, I would say, fine, two more years, I will do the commute. Yeah. But if you are just starting your career, well, what do you have to lose? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then, I mean, there was a comment on the chat earlier that work from home was there since 20 years now. And then there is something called freelancers, right? In IT, we have freelancers.com, right? How are solopreneurs different than freelancers?
They are not. I mean, frankly, that's a good catch. I don't see there is a big difference, right? I just one. If you call yourself a freelancer, then this is the deliberate choice that you have made in the past. You want to be a freelancer. But many people found themselves in the freelancer mode without really trying to get there.
Yeah, probably. I have heard cases, I mean, know some of them who actually took offers from multiple companies and they seamlessly served them, right? So now, I mean, the CEOs of company cannot say that it's cheating, right? Their product, I mean, they got the deliverables they needed, right? So what's the problem there?
Kind of hard to say. I want to answer Ben's question, right? Because Ben touched a very important aspect which I have missed in this talk. Right now, we benefit from pre-existing familiarity with teams people that we can trust. If we work from home for the next 10 years, do you anticipate any new challenges and how might we mitigate them? This is awesome question and it goes, I mean, you can look at the freelancers community. How do you build your network and how do you build trust with other people? You've got to learn marketing and sales. You've got to spend time trying to network with other people, meet them, talk to them, even if on Zoom. Some people have a strong preference that they will not accept anyone on LinkedIn unless they spend talking to them 15 minutes. It's amazing how this stuff can work. But if you are not willing to do the marketing stuff, then I'm afraid it's time to think about the office.
Well, talking about trust, one of my team members who I had never met, right? And we hardly had just that 10-15 minutes of video call, and every other meeting was without the video. Yet he said, I trust you, Manish, right? And in one of the calls, he said, I trust you, right? Which basically means we really do not require physical meeting even once to trust each
Uh,
other.
I will be careful about that because in order to build trust, there is a couple of things that need to happen, and there is the book called The Like Switch, which says in order to create bond between people, you need I mean, the bond is the stronger, the more frequent are the meetings, the longer they are, and the stronger emotional response they create, right? They don't require physical proximity, but if you frequently talk with other people and you create strong emotional response, you start developing some feelings towards them, which may be either positive or negative. Yeah.
Yeah.
So office or face to face can accelerate that process, but isn't really required. But then, some people will never build or trust you completely unless they spend with you a couple of days, weeks, and see you in really difficult situation, right? So this is perhaps a personal preference.
Yeah. Especially a difficult situation. A team that has
Yeah.
pulled themselves off from a difficult situation would trust each other more than a team that has only tasted success together. So,
So, I mean, I will perhaps share a personal attitude here because I tend to trust people which I understand, even if they are not trustworthy. So, if people, I mean, if they are kind of, if I kind of know what they are capable of doing, then I will trust them to the extent they allow me. And the most difficult part of group of people for me to trust are people who I don't understand, because this is like, walking chaos. Okay, we have 10 minutes left till the next call, I think. So thank you everyone for your attention. Manish, any last or closing words?
there is one comment here. Would you like
Holger,
to
are you?
address? There's one comment here. Would you like
Yeah,
to address or a question from it's Cancel. She says the book culture map gives
yeah.
also different perspectives how people develop trust, independent from being remote or not. So, do you think in remote world trust means predictability
I'm
of a
not sure if
person? If you
it
could
generally
predict
means.
a person's behavior, then you would trust each other more. Because you
Okay,
can't see, you don't have the visual cues. Seldom people use videos, and you say on off, right? They can just turn off the video.
okay. So I mean, I can talk about I can talk only about me here, and this is, and I'm not sure if I should share that, but what I generally think is, when I think, and this is almost, I shouldn't be saying that, but way I think other people, when I know what other people are looking for because they have expressed it and they are acting consistently what they have said in the past, I tend to trust them, at least in those aspects that cover their goals. Because if I know their goals or values and they have shown that they act consistently on that, I know that they will behave in this particular way in the future, right? So this is quite rational to trust them, right?
Yeah,
Even if I can verbalize it. But if there are people who are quite, closed in terms of their values and goals, then my level of trust goes instantly down, because I don't know what they are after, and whether this thing, what they are after, isn't critical for me, right? So this is more or less.
let me rephrase the question. I would say we are talking about trust so much and value it so much because it is directly related to control. In remote setting, there is no control at all, and so therefore, to be able to work, right? We should be able to work effectively and efficiently without having to have control that typical office setting would provide managers with
Okay,
directly.
so direct control isn't there, but indirect control seems to be the focus on, since I was talking about KPIs and stuff like that. So you can't really say, and you shouldn't even try to see what your employees are doing at every possible moment of time, because this is terribly wrong approach. You should have metrics which say how well is your company operating, and perhaps how individual efforts help move those metrics in one or other way. No direct control, no need for surveillance and stuff like that, but a lot of effort required to get this stuff right and evolving. Yeah? No trust required.
Oh, you say no trust required, like a blockchain trustless stuff. Oh boy.
No trust required. I mean, if you have the KPIs which say that you are working well, or the company is working well because you are working well, then why bother
Hmm.
with trust?
Yeah, that's a new. I mean, that expanded my mind. No trust required. Oh boy. Oh.
Okay, so I will give you 7 minutes back Again, thank you for your patience.
Thank you,
Speak to you
Chris.
hopefully next time.
Yeah, thank you.